Hello, this is Richard, and we're going to learn a little bit more about Blender. Like I said in the last video, we're going to learn about the 3D view panel down here, and all of these buttons. I promise this one will go a lot faster than the last one, although these are still really important buttons for you to learn and know how to use. They're all going to help you do different things when you're modeling. Now, first, I should say that each of these things that you see here are a window. Let's hide the tool shelf. And each window has this little icon right here where you can choose what's displayed in that window. See, here where the windows divide, I can drag them like this. So Blender's really modular in this way. You can see a lot of different things all at once and change around how you view them based on what you choose for those little windows and what you're doing. You might be dragging these around quite a bit. I like to set mine up a certain way, and you'll like to set yours up a different way probably. It really depends on a lot of factors, and Blender is very malleable in that way that it allows you to use it however works best for you. So if we click right here, I can show you what I'm talking about. That is where we change from the 3D view, where we model things, to the timeline. So here's a big timeline. When we're animating things, it's going to play them. It's not great to have that big. You all probably have it down here when you first start up and you don't know what to do with it. We haven't gotten to it yet, and we probably won't for a while. Switch back to 3D view. Look at some of these others. There's movie clip editor, which has a few options. It'll have more when you do more with that. Movie sequence editor. There's the graph editor. This is for animating your meshes and how quick they start moving, stop moving, things like that. There's a logic editor for the game, where you can add different sets of logic to it. Text editor, so you can do Python scripting. There's node editor, which I actually do use quite a bit. I don't use any of those others really, since I'm making models for a video game. They're not too useful in Blender. I'll do a lot of that stuff in my game engine. But the node editor, this is where you can create materials and things, and you can add textures, and you can add colors, and you can add normal maps if you know what those are, like putting the bumps on a flat texture. And you can use math to change these things, or add a script in. Here's your inputs and shaders, which are really important to materials as well. So the node editor is really important, and this is in cycles render that we're looking at this. These are the different engines that can render in Blender. I recommend using cycles and learning cycles because I think it's only going to get more powerful, and it's going to outpace the Blender render. And we'll get to the node editor we'll give it its own video a little later. The properties, well, that's kind of ugly, and now the panel jumped up to the top. But this is what you have over here, all the way to the right, just really, really big. Let's switch back to 3D view. It's what's over here. It's all this mess, and it just made it really big. So, and you can switch it to the outliner, which is what's up here. That's the outliner. Very useful for seeing all the things in your scene, and we can look at this cube and see what it's all made of. There's our mesh, there's the material that'll go on it, and a texture, and collapse it all back down. Quickly select things like now the camera's selected, back in the background, now the lamp's selected. Just pretty easy that way. Get rid of that guy. And user preferences, that's the same as going to File and User Preferences here. Watch, I'll show you. If you click that one, now we have that pop-up, which is the same as if you went to File, User Preferences. Wow, that's kind of hard on the eyes. So I don't ever go to it here. I don't know why you would want that as its own window. But you can if you want. And then Info, which is this top bar here, that's actually its own window, and it just displays File, Render, Window, Help, these different views. And then we've got the different scenes and your render and some information about what you're modeling. And if you pull that down, you can see some debug code so you can know if something's going wrong up there. I don't ever look at that. I have no need for it. If I do something wrong, it's pretty apparent what I did, and I'll just have to undo and redo it. And then another really important one is the UV image editor. When we render something, by hitting F12. Let's just do this real quick. It's going to be beautiful. Wow, I've got this big thing blocking my camera, and there's no world lighting. There's just the one light lighting it up. It looks really ugly and gray and bland and bare because we just kind of extruded some stuff. It's just some junk. So this is my image. It's just a flat image that's been spit out. It's just, I can save it as a JPEG or a PNG or what have you. And I would just go here to image, save a copy, or I could hit F3 and save it. But I'm looking at this. The more important thing, I'm looking at this in the UV image editor right here is what this is in, and then I can just go back to 3D view here. So if I'm in my UV image editor, I can also just hit F11 and it'll jump me back to 3D view. That's pretty much all your options here, so that you can set up any of these windows how you like them. Since I don't do a lot of animating, I'll generally pull this bottom one up a bit, and I'll switch this one here to node editor so that I can do more with my materials and textures, because I like playing around with that. But I'll switch it back to timeline because this is more of how yours looks. So then next up we have these options down here. View, it's a different ways to view things. We talked about that previously in the first video, I think. You can toggle full screen, or you can hit shift space. See, it just gets rid of all your other windows and makes your active window full screen. See, I'll put this over here. And remember, wherever your mouse is, that's the window that's active. It's just a quick way, shift space, to jump into a full screen of something. And it's really handy if I have my node editor up here. I can open it up because nodes can take up a lot of room here just to switch in and out of that, so then I can see what I've done with my materials and how they're coming along. And then I can go back in here and have more space to edit them. And then that's just shift space. It says control up arrow. I've never done it that way. Let's see what happens. Oh, same thing. Shift space is a lot easier to do one-handed. I don't have to take my hand off the mouse. And then toggle quad view. We talked about this one as well. It gives you 3 perfect views and your camera view. So top, front, and right orthographic from one perspective, so that you can make those little intricate changes and see how it's going to affect it in 3-dimensional space. A lot easier than if you're just looking at it and then you have to move your camera around and then look at it a different way and move your camera around. That can get really tedious. I go into quad view a lot, and I remember the left-handed hotkey. It's really easy. It's Control-Alt-Q. It'd be nice if it was just hit caps lock to turn it on and off. That might be nice since I don't use caps lock for anything ever. But Control-Alt-Q, once you do it a few times, you'll pretty much remember. Whoop. Now I don't want to quit. And something to note is, see, I'm hitting Control-Alt-Q. Whichever window my mouse is in is the one that's going to go full screen. So if I put my mouse in the camera and hit Control-Alt-Q to go out of this, it jumps it into the camera perspective. Control-Alt-Q again to go back into quad view. I'll put it in the top, and now I'm in the top. I'll put my mouse in the front, now I'm in the front, and I'll put it in the right box, and now I'm in the right. So just know that. I mean, I'll usually jump back into top view, Control-Alt-Q back in there, and then I hold the middle mouse button, and I can pan around it. Now I'm back in user perspective. See up here, it tells you what you're viewing your object in. And it shows you the hotkeys here on the right as well. So that's really handy also. Playback animation, if we get into animating, we'll use that one. Duplicate area into new window, it's just as easy to just do this and choose what you want. View all, view selected, view global, local. Yeah, and that just kind of jumps you around. Period, that's really handy. Whatever you select and hit period, it'll focus on it. Especially if you get into really intricate close-up stuff, this can be really handy to get you out and back to a centered view on your object. And you can also select things up here in the outliner. See where I am? I'll select the lamp, which is out of my view, and I'll hit period, and it jumps me to it. And I'll select the cube up here in the outliner. Whoops, I have to do that in the right window. And hit period, and it jumps me back to my weird cube that I've changed. And let me mention this right now since I'm thinking about it. In the outliner here, you can just double-click and rename things. Let's make this the monstrosity, big, ugly, monolithic thing that we've extruded from previous videos. And then You can view it as local or global. I prefer to work in global mode, just rarely going into local. I'm not really going to deal much about talking about local mode. You won't need it as a beginner, so we'll just kind of leave that for a more intermediate course. Render border, zoom border, clipping border, line view. These are all different views that you can choose for different reasons. We're going to kind of jump over those. These here are important though. Left, right, back, front, bottom, top, camera. I recommend learning these hotkeys, and it's really easy. If you have a keyboard with a number pad on it, use it, because you'll want to go into these quite frequently just to make little tweaks and look at different things. So 7 is top, always handy. 1 is front, 3 is right, and 5 takes you in and out of ortho. So now I'm in user perspective, I hit 5, now I'm in orthographic, and I can move around in orthographic perspective. Hit 5 again, and I'm out of it. But if I'm in top view, and I want to just edge it down a little bit, I'll hit 2. And see, it now says user ortho, and I'm slowly rotating it with the top going away from me. And 8 does the opposite. And then also handy are 4 and 6, which rotates counterclockwise and clockwise. So I can go down clockwise and change my view just a little bit if I need to move something that, like if these were perfect cubes standing up on the floor, I would look at them from the top and edge it down just a little so that I could see the bottom edge. And then I could edge it back up that same amount, so now I'm back to the top. And it might help me scale things correctly or do other little tiny workflow things as well. And then you can generally hold Control and hit the same one to get the opposite side. So I hit 7. Now I'm on the top. Control 7 would be the bottom. Now it says bottom ortho. I hit 1 and I'm looking at the front. I hit Control 1 and I'm looking at the back. I hit 3 and I'm looking to the right. Control 3 looks to the left. So those are pretty easy to remember once you start really using them a lot, and I recommend you use them a lot because with perspective, it's hard to tell how big the back of this is because of the 3 lines of oh my gosh, the 3 lines of visibility, points of perspective. It's going to be making things further away smaller. I just had a total brain fart there, sorry. Let's move on. Tool shelf and properties, we talked about these already. T and N, you can toggle them here if you forget how. So T hides the tool shelf, N is the property shelf. This shelf is really messy, it needs a lot of work. Hopefully that is coming because the 2.70 redesign added these tabs over here and it really cleaned up the tool shelf. Hopefully the property shelf is next. So let's just keep that ugly thing hidden. One thing I would like to note over here on the property shelf, I'll give this its own video. It's going to be much later because this does a lot of different things with a lot of different things, which is why it's kind of ugly and they're all kind of jumbled in here. It's a mess. But when we were in quad view, you see how I have my camera here. This is what's going to be rendered inside this red box. I have it outlined in red, and I really like this because now if I rotate my object with the middle mouse button or shift middle mouse button to pan it or zoom in and out, my camera goes with that view, and that's not the default. So I have it set in my properties panel. You open it by hitting in, just like this, hit in, and it's under view, and I chose lock camera to view. See how I unselect it? Now I don't have that red border, and if I try to rotate, oh, now I'm in user perspective. I'm no longer in camera perspective. I'll hit 0 to go back into my camera, 0 on the numpad, and then let's check that lock camera to view. Now I rotate and the camera stays with me. So I think it's a much easier way to set up your render and what's going to be rendered if you have that locked to your camera, or the camera locked to your view. And 0 to get out of it. So that does it for view. Select, this is going to be different types of ways that you can select things. Mirror, random, inverse, deselect all, circle select, border select. Let's talk about those real quick. This will be easier to see in edit mode, and it's just the same. Let's go to vertex mode, and A to deselect everything. Here's our gross topology that we left off with from the last video. So C, just hit C. Now you have this circle. And you can paint in your selections like this. See how I'm clicking with my left mouse button, and everything that is under that circle while I click is selected. And then I right mouse click to undo it, to get out of the circle select. Now, if I'm in circle select, I can scroll my mouse wheel. Scrolling it up makes that smaller so that I can select smaller area with each mouse click. Scrolling it down makes it bigger so that I can brush in a lot of things all at once. And then A to deselect. Now, box mode as well is B, and I'll get this little crosshairs with the lines going so that I can see exactly what's going to be selected. I'll click here, whoops, B, and then I'll click and hold and drag my box around what I want to select. Now, one thing to note is because these are all solid, I'm looking at it in the solid view of edit mode. I have not selected any of the backside that I couldn't see. That's something to think about as well. And we'll get into that with one of the next buttons. I'll show you a little bit more about that. Let's deselect everything and let's tab back into object mode since that's where we started. So circle select, border select. Oh, I always called it box select. I guess it's called border select. Whatever. C and B, those are handy to learn as well. You can use them in object mode also, but you're just going to get a whole object. And we only have one object, so you have to go over the origin point. We only have one object, so it's more interesting to show you how they worked in edit mode. And B, just the same. There we go. Now we selected everything. Add. This is the same thing you have here. Just Shift A. That's the easiest way. Wherever your 3D cursor is, that's where you're going to add something. So, some cool things here. The torus, that's just like a donut. Monkey is a monkey head. It's the Blender mascot. Suzanne, I think, is her name. Just something to play around with. And here's where you can add your curves. See, there's a curve. And if I go into edit mode, I can grab these pink guys here and change my curve. We use that with some intermediate things with some modifiers, which I might show you in a different video once we get to this one, the properties window. Let's get rid of that curve. Here's where you can add your different types of lights, which you can edit over in the properties window, and some other things like armature, lattice, cameras, text. Generally, that's all more intermediate as well. Text is where you can add some 3D lettering, which is fun to play around with as well. And that was Shift A to add things, or you can just click on these buttons. Objects. No, let me say real quick. No, let's put that 3D cursor here where let's add something, because I want to show you real quick. Let's do a sphere. We get a sphere and it's got a whole bunch of polygons all around it. It pops up these properties after we add it. Before we do anything else, we can change this sphere that we just added. And you have to do this now, because if you go away and come back to it, you won't have these options anymore. It'll be added and it'll be how it is, and you have to change it by modeling techniques, not through this little menu. So if we want a lower poly sphere, because it's going to be far away, you're not really going to notice it very much, you're going to build it into something else, take this segments here, and let's take it down, and you can see it's taking away one segment from the vertice at the very top to the vertice at the very bottom. And if we go all the way down to 3, let's look at it from the top. We have an almost triangular sphere thing. So let's bump that back up to, I don't know, 14. Now it's more spherical up top. And you can see adding more and more and more makes it more and more round, all the way down to 3. And the rings are these rings. 18 all the way down And you can do this type of modification with cylinders and pretty much everything. It'll give you these little options before it's completely added. Here's where you can change what size it is. And you can always right-click in any of these menus and reset them to the default value. So if you made some change and it's really ugly, just right-click in that little bar and reset to default. Align it to view is going to align that object to however your view is. See how it's flipping it to put the top right at me? And then location. This is where it's going to be entered if you don't want it exactly at the 3D cursor. Oh, now it's put it at the origin of the world. And then rotation. So you can do all that here too. I generally just deal with the shape of it, and then I'll rotate and translate it however I want after that. So we can leave that there. That's fine. It can hang out with us. And now, having said that about add, let's go to object. Object. Now, there's some unique things about this menu that you'll want to learn some of these hotkeys when you start to use them, but if you don't, just know that they're here so that you can find them again. Convert to. This is really handy if you're making vines or utility cables or coiled rope, and you want to do it with a curve. You put in that curve like I showed you, and you wrap it around and coil it. You can then render it as a curve with some options from the properties window, which we'll get into, or you can change it into a mesh. So this is where you would do that. A mesh from curve right there. You can change that curve into a mesh, and then you can edit it like it's a normal object and not a curve. And then why don't we just go ahead and show that real quick. We've got a curve here. That looks pretty nice, and that's Alt-C. Mesh. Now you'll see up here how it's a little curve shape, and then we change it to a mesh, and now it's a mesh. If we go into edit mode, you can see it's now made up of all these little vertices. Whereas when it was a curve, it's made up of these nodes that you can change the curve. And that's what that's used for. Show, hide. This is really important too. See how cluttered this all is? What if I was looking at it from this point and we had a bunch of this gunk all over and we wanted to edit that circle? Well, let's just select this object and hit H. Let's hide it. And now it's not gone, we're just not looking at it. Another way you can do this is look up here. Our monstrosity that we named, let's select it. It's not showing up because it's hidden, as you can tell by this little eye that isn't showing. You click the eye and now it's back. Everything that has the eye lit up is shown in our scene. We can hide the monstrosity, we can hide the lamp up there, we can hide this camera back here, and then we can bring them all back by clicking that eye. Or if we hide something, Alt-H brings everything back. H hides it, Alt-H brings it back. Or you can just go in here to Object and hide the selected. And then if you just want to show one thing, you don't want to bring everything back, you can do hide or show hidden. No, never mind. It'll bring back everything. Yep. So you have to bring everything back. Sorry, I thought I found something in the menu. But what is interesting is if I only want to work on this sphere, and there's a bunch of gobbledygook everywhere, I've got all these objects in my scene, driving me crazy, I just want to work on the sphere. There's a neat way to do this. You go to Object, Show Hide, Hide Unselected, Shift-H. And it hides everything but what's selected. So I just want to work on my sphere and it's all hidden and I want to get rid of everything. I'll just click Sphere up here since I can find it easier in my outline, and Shift-H, everything else is gone. Now I'm just working on my sphere. When I'm ready to bring it all back, Alt-H. Hiding is pretty important once you start working on a lot of things. It can be very, very helpful. There's some game stuff that you can do, which we're not really going to get into. Quick Fur, Quick Explode, Quick Smoke. This is probably going to be changing in the next few updates, so I'm not really going to go over it. It's a little bit outside of beginner stuff to do some of those, and with it changing, we'll probably highlight that when it is sufficiently working in its new form. Constraints, that's a little more advanced. Group, you can group things together. It's a bit more advanced as well. Track parent, make single user local. Okay, delete, the X button or the delete button. We went over that already. Animation, and we'll get to these a little bit later. Undo, redo, Control Z, Control Shift Z brings everything back, or redoes. And you also have those buttons here under Tools, undo, redo. Now, object mode, edit mode, you can switch between them. We went over that as well. This here switches your viewport shading so that you can show things in their bounding box. Everything that it would take to contain them inside a box that is structured around the XYZ axis. And then wireframe shows us a see-through wireframe of the basic geometry. See, it doesn't have all our weird geometry that we added in here. It was all gross. Solid is what we were looking at. Texture will show any textures that you've added over here in the properties view. Materials are any of your materials, which can be multiple textures all layered on one another and showing in different ways. So it's kind of like Texture Plus. It's really, really handy to look at your materials in this way in Materials, because the next view setting, Rendered, actually renders it with your render engine, the Cycles render. So I move this around, see how it's kind of going all snowy and crazy? It's because it's actively trying to render it with cycles each time I do something or make a change. This can crash your system if you have a lot of different materials and a lot of different objects and lights everywhere, and it's got to refract and bounce. It can take up a lot of your system just moving around. So I suggest when you get there to just leave it in the material setting. And then Z switches back and forth between solid and wireframe. And you'll use this a lot. Now what I was saying is let's go to edit mode and deselect that with A. Let's hit C and let's brush in some of these, and how it only selects them on one side. Let's deselect with A. If I hit Z to go into wireframe, it'll show me everything, all of my edges and verts of my selected object that I'm editing. And now when I go into C and paint in some selections, it's on all sides of it, as you can see. So that's what wireframe is really good for, is looking through things, selecting all of something, all edges of something, so that you can edit it all together and not having to rotate the camera around your objects. This here, next we have the pivot point. So if I want to rotate this, it's rotating around that little orange button, that little origin point. And this one here is going to rotate around that origin point. If we change this, or if we select both of them, there's a point in between those two right here that it'll rotate around. If we change this to bounding box center, that's not the point between the origins, it's the point between those bounding boxes that I showed you before. And it might be a little bit different. It's usually generally about the same as the origins. If you have special origins, if you've set them differently, then it might be different. Now let's change it to 3D cursor. My 3D cursor is way over here. When I rotate, now everything is rotating around my 3D cursor. And if I move my 3D cursor, everything's rotating around it over there. That's really handy as well. I like to use this with the period and comma buttons. There are lots of reasons you would want this. I'm drawing a blank on what any of them are now, but I do use it a lot. Just period to switch to the 3D cursor as the rotation point, comma to switch back to your previous selection. Individual origins. Now we're back. This one's really interesting. Now we're back to rotating around the individual origins. If I selected this one and rotated it, it's going to rotate around its individual origin. If I select both of these, they're both going around their own origin points. They're not rotating together around the central point like they were when median point was selected. That's really handy as well if you want to tweak a whole bunch of things. If a whole bunch of different objects need to be rotated based on their own origins, obviously you would set this to individual origins. Make sure you switch it back. Some things can have problems if it's set to individual origins. Like there's sometimes when scaling might not scale right if it's set to individual origin rather than median point. And then active element. So see how this one is highlighted in yellow? And then if I hold shift and also select this one, now this one changed to orange. The sphere is now orange highlighted. Highlight? I don't know. And the monstrosity is now in yellow. That means it's active. And the little origin point also changes from orange to yellow. Now if we rotate it, it's all rotating around that one. That's handy as well if you have one thing that needs to be rotated in relation to another thing. And they're all really handy and really useful. That's why they're in a button right here. You can use them all the time, however you want. And then we have these tools here, which changes your transformation tool from grabbing and moving things, from translating. I don't know why my mind does not want to remember that word. From translating objects to rotating. This is your rotate transform tool. To scaling with the little boxes on it. This is your scale tool. And you know what? I don't ever use those. Just hit R to rotate. You know, hit S to scale. And hit G to grab. Or just, I grab these to grab. I just leave it on the grab. On the translate transform tool. And then you can hit G and X, and now I'm just moving it along the X-axis. Or S and Z, and now I'm just scaling it along the Z. Or R and Y, and now I'm rotating it around the Y-axis. I kind of went over that in the past video as well, so we're going to continue. The transform orientation. View, gimbal, normal, local, global. View just matches it to your current view. There's no reason to do this other than maybe with scale, if you want to get a specific way to scale it. But then you have to hit scale, X, puts it on the global X-axis, hit X again to put it on your view, on your selected. So then, you know, you can change things like that. That might be the only reason, if you have a specific way you want something scaled or rotated. But I mean, there's better ways to do those things than to put your transform orientation on view. Gimbal, normal, local. Normal is pretty useful as well. Let's go into edit mode to show this to you, and let's look at a face. The normal is the direction that this face, the tangent of this face. So see that Z, that blue Z, it's pointing directly away. Is it tangent? I don't think it's tangent. I used the wrong word. It's perpendicular to the plane of the face. It's pointing directly away from the face. So your local, your normal Z-axis points up from the faces. And let's go into here real quick and I'll show you what I mean by normals. You see these little blue lines sticking out? That's the direction all my normals are facing. And you can see that one points that way, this one points towards us kind of, this one points towards us and down, that one points that way. And this is how it's going to reflect light using this normal. And then if we accidentally have something messed up, let's flip that one. Don't really worry about what I just did there. I'm just flipping it. Now you don't see that normal pointing out. It's pointing inside. So if we were to do a render of this real quick, of course it's not going to look different because I'm trying to show you. Light bounces off it in a funny way. It's going to make your renders look gross and weird. You're going to have a lot of weird problems if one of those normals is pointed the wrong direction. Take my word for it. You can flip these Did I talk about that last video? Maybe I did. You can flip them with this button under shading UVs if I didn't. Flip direction, or you can select everything and recalculate. And of course you can also hit Control-N to recalculate all your normals and flip them all back outside. So that's very handy as well. Oop. Let's turn that off before I forget. And that's why you would select normal. Now it's not really changed here in object mode because I've got a bunch of normals all pointing different directions. It doesn't really know which one to choose, which way to point. Local can be handy. See, it's the average direction that, let me say it this way, it's the direction of your bounding box. See, my bounding box is pointing this direction, and my transform tool is also aligned to that bounding box. It's kind of like the average direction that your object is pointing. So if you want something to be moved in that average direction with your object, you'll choose bounding box. You'll choose local for your transform orientation. And then global, that's the general one that this grid is based off of, that when you hit X and then Z, whoops, when you hit G and then Z, you're moving along the global. You hit G and then Y, you've locked it to the global Y. And then we get into layers. These are your different layers. By default, you're working in layer 1, and then you can add new stuff here in layer 2 or 3 or 4, just to generally keep your workflow separated. If you're building, let's say, all of your trees, you build all those in this layer, and then in this layer you do all of your rocks, and then in this layer you do your ground and your grass, and in this layer you do your roads. And in this next layer, you get to put in all your little woodland creatures in it. In this next layer, you put your demon romping through eating them. You know, so that you can separate your workflow into different layers and only look at the things that you're working on grouped in specific ways. You can break it up however you want. It's pretty handy. If you're just doing small stuff, you might just stick with one. Then you can also shift-click these to view multiple layers all together. And the number row on the top of your keyboard switches between these. 1 is the first layer, 2 is the second, 3, 4, 5. Now watch, 6 jumps to the top of this next little group. You would think that it would jump to the bottom over here, but no, that one is 11. You gotta click down there to get that many. So to move things between layers, for some reason, I don't really work in layers. I had a brain fart in one of my other videos and I couldn't remember how to do this. You just hit M, and then you can move it to layer 2. There we go. Now we click on layer 2, and you'll see the globe. And then we click on layer 1, and you'll see monstrosity. And then we shift and we click both of them, we see both layers. So let's hit M1, we moved everything back to the first layer. So we can just click and have that as our only layer. M, move things between layers. M for move. Pretty basic. This button is a little more, it's past beginner. It's to use the scene's active camera and layers in this view rather than the local layers, and you can do your scene work up here. We're not really going to get into that. Now this next one is proportional editing. You won't use this so much in object mode as you will in edit mode. It just lets you proportionally edit things. We'll go into that more in edit mode. This one snaps things together. Let's snap it to faces of monstrosity. See how I'm trying to move it and it's kind of giving me a little bit of a headache because that little yellow circle is picking what face to snap this to. Right here it's at the edge, so it's coming through it a little bit. I'm locked to the x-axis though because I grabbed on that x-axis. Let's just hit G to grab it, and now I move it around. I'm on the edges of these faces. It's locking, or it's snapping it to those faces. See it, how it popped over there? And it pops back. It's trying to figure out a way to press this up against that face. Just so. This is nice for doing retopologizing. When you retopologize like a face or a character from a high poly sculpt down to a low poly model that you can use in a game, that's advanced. So don't worry about any of that. It's nice for setting things on tables, but there's a better way to do it, which we'll get into a little bit later. It's also an easier way to do it. And then closest active median center, and then volume face, just a few different options of how to snap it to things. And then align rotation with the snapping target, that's also handy. Oh, I turned it off. It's going to rotate this object based on the normal value. See that? Now it's facing to the side, now it's tilted up a little bit, now it's tilted to the other side, now it's tilted down a little bit. That can also be handy for different reasons that you would need. Project individual elements onto the surface of another object. This is much more advanced. This is how you would like, if I took a plane, I could kind of fold it over everything I've made here. Don't worry about that too much for your beginning needs. You won't need it. But snap, you might want to use that a little bit here and there. Mostly as a beginner, you're going to want to work in object mode, edit mode, change these around, definitely between wireframe and solid. You might want to do some materials if you get into that, but mostly between wireframe and solid with the Z button. That's important to use. Changing these pivot points, that's important as well for how things rotate. It's really good to use in your workflow. It does make some things easier. Changing this from global to normal is very helpful a lot of the time, especially in edit mode, and local can sometimes be helpful as well. Layers, yes, if your scenes are getting messy, divide some things up into layers. Proportional editing, yes, that's very important. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that here in a minute. And then we get to this button, that's your render. It just makes a render of whatever you have. F11 gets back, or you can click here and switch to 3D view. And then this one's also a render button. It would do frames of an animation. See that little black box counting up? That's going down my timeline, rendering each frame in an animation, but I haven't set anything up to be animated, and it just saved it in a temp file. Dang it, I didn't really need that. I'll go in and delete it later. But that's all these buttons in object mode. Let's tab over to edit mode, and this shouldn't take too long. Let's use the monstrosity here. In edit mode, the main differences are that we have in view, it's pretty much all the same. Select, it's pretty much all the same. Select boundary loop, inner region, don't worry too much about those. Loose geometry, interior faces, that one's really handy. It'll give you any faces you have inside your objects, and if they're not there for a specific reason, you can select them and delete them. You want to get rid of those, they might mess up your render. And then loose geometry, it'd be anything that was kind of hanging, kind of weird. It could be handy, I don't really use it that much. Random, that's good for making like rocks and jaggies and things in those rocks. Like if you have it in vert mode and you have a bunch of vertices, you can select random and then you can scale them all together to get a different topology that will change by a random factor. It can be very handy for making things look random. And then select faces by sides can be handy as well. It'll select all of your four-sided faces, all of your n-gons, or all of your tries, so that you know where to focus to get rid of these things. That's very, very handy for getting a good topology. And inverse I should talk about. So I want to just work on this guy here. I want to select everything else and delete it. Control I switches from what I've selected to everything else. Now I can X delete everything else and I'm left with just what I selected. That's Control I, whoops, Control I to invert what you've selected. Now notice I can't select that sphere because it's a different object. I'm just going to iterate that again. Circle select, border select, we've already talked about. Add, you have fewer options here because we're in object mode. There's fewer things that you can add in object mode because they're all going to be a part of the same object over here named monstrosity. And these little plugs, these are plugins and add-ons. I would suggest looking at some of those. We'll do plugins in its own video. And then mesh, these are different ways that you can edit a mesh. Bisect, delete, extrude, duplicate. We've done these in different places. UV unwrap, that's going to be much later. Snap, mirror, transform, okay. And then you have the same options here. Wireframe, it's still Z to go into wireframe, but now, unlike object mode wireframe, it shows the whole topology. All of these ugly little cuts that we did. It shows all of that in wireframe mode as well, where, look, wireframe in object mode doesn't. It just shows you a simple outline. In edit mode, it shows everything in wireframe. And then this sphere is not selected. It's just going to show you the simple geometry there. And all this is the same. The pivot points, all that's exactly the same, works the same. But we do have these three buttons here, which I've used before in the other videos. They're very important. They are your vertex, edge, and face. So now I can select whole faces, now I can select edges, and vertices. You definitely want to use those buttons. They're very, very important. And you can select more than one, so that you're selecting edges or vertices. You can select a whole edge or just a vertice just by holding Shift. And then this one here is going to show you, this turns occlusion on or off. It's the occlusion button. I click it, and now I can kind of see through it. Yeah, I guess some people like working in this mode. I always accidentally select things I don't want to select when I have that turned on. I don't like it. I'd rather go into wireframe. So, I mean, there's that if you want to use it. I don't. Proportional editing. Let's go back into object mode, select our sphere, and go back into edit mode. I'm going to grab this thing and let's focus on it so I can show you proportional editing. Let's click connected. And I'm going to click that vertice. Now I'm going to grab it with G and then lock it to the x-axis. And I pull it, and look, it's pulling all those other vertices out with it. That's because it's proportionally editing those. Instead of just pulling one, I'm pulling all of them. And just like with circle select, my mouse wheel makes this circle larger or smaller. Scrolling up makes it smaller, scrolling down makes it larger. And you can see the circle pulls in more vertices. The vertices that are inside it are going to scale proportionally related to how close or connected they are to the vertice that I've selected. You can do this with whole faces or edges, it doesn't matter. But what you have selected is not going to scale proportionally. So watch, if I select, I'll do this whole loop. Let's grab it and lock it to X. I'm going to scale that whole loop, and it all stays exactly the same. Everything else moves proportionally. So you have to be careful with what you select, because what you select is not going to change. And then let me show you with a plane. Here's a plane. We are going to grab this side of it. We're going to look at it from the side and grab it with C. We're just going to pull this up. You can see the shape that this makes. It's kind of a nice hill if you were to run down the top of it. Let's change this button here, right next to our proportional editing. Let's change it to sharp. Now you pull it up, and now it's like the tines of a fork, maybe. That's more like a slide if you were to run down it. And then we can change it to sphere, and now it's more of a spherical curve. We can change it to random, and you pull it up and everything else moves up randomly, which is also nice for making terrain or rocks or jaggies. And root, you know, there are different ways. There's also linear. I mean, as I change it, it changes how it moves. I guess you could use that. But I would just do the period and comma trick that I showed you previously. So generally I use smooth or sharp depending on what I'm wanting to change. Now let's look at just enabling it. I usually use it on connected because I want the connected stuff to move. But if I just enable it, let's go up here and let's scroll that down. And let's hit Z. That's not a good example because everything inside the circle, it's a sphere, it's all going to move together. Let's delete some stuff here. It's hard to tell with what I'm showing you, but there are times when you will want to use projected because it selects everything inside the circle and moves it proportionally the distance it is away within that circle, whether it's connected or not. Actually, I know. Let's grab this whole thing and move it up to our sphere. These are two different objects. And now look, even the sphere is moving because those vertices are within range of that circle. I'll scroll it up, but it's not connected. Nothing I've selected is connected to that sphere, even here. So those two things are deforming together. And then I can select just the sphere and move it away. Whoops, let's turn this off. Oh, turns that off or on. And they're not connected anymore, but they did edit together. So that's the difference between just enabling it and doing connected. I prefer connected most of the time. There are a few times you would want to just enable it. Now, when you're on connected and you hit O, it changes it to regular enabled. Hit O again and it turns it off. So be aware of that. You might have to undo a few times until you get used to it. Just hitting O just enables it. And be aware of that also. It won't put you into connected. Let's turn that off and move to snap. Let's change this to vertex closest, and now let's just grab that, see how it's snapping between these vertexes. Let's zoom in. It's snapping between these vertexes. It's a nice way to make sure that you have good geometry for things. You can do it with whole objects. It'll snap to these vertexes as I select them on this plane. And then a really good button to use, this one here, is your automatic merge. So I take this vertex and I move it super close to that other one. It's going to merge the two together when it gets close enough. See, now I just have one. It snapped those two together. Now, if you don't want to use that button, just turn it off, and let's select this vertex and this one. Alt-M. You'll use this a lot. Alt-M. You can now merge at the last one you selected, or if I select this one first and then that one last, Alt-M. I can merge them at the first one I selected. Undo that. Or this one and this one. Let's do Alt-M at center, and it's going to move those equidistant between the two of them. Alt-M at cursor centers them at the 3D cursor. Alt-M collapse brings them to each other pretty much. Alright, that is pretty much everything for this video for the 3D view panel. Hopefully that wasn't too long or too intense, but that should get you going. If you watch the tools video and this video, you should be going with modeling. It should give you the tools you need to do pretty much anything you want. Just practice, practice, practice. There's no substitute for hours put into this program. The more practice you get, the better you get. You're always going to be progressing. Always. I would not say I'm good at Blender. I would say I'm competent because there's still so much to learn even after all the time that I put into it. So, hope to see you in the next video. We're going to go over this properties window, and it might take a while. I know these are supposed to be quick videos, and they're kind of not, but I don't want to skip anything when it's all so important. Hopefully you got a good idea of what you needed. If you have questions, please put them in the comments. I'll always check those, always read them. And let me know what else you need, and I'll try to get to it. Thanks.